Okay, this is the video for the Unit 14 review for the final exam here in Algebra 2. This is our radicals and fractions that we talked about at the very end of the year. So for number 44, we start with some radicals here. We want to follow the order of operations. So we're going to go ahead and take care of these parentheses first by distributing the -7 radical 5. So remember, when we are distributing, it's multiplication. So technically, we're doing -7 square root of 5 times 2 radical 3. So when we multiply that, we would do the -7 times 2 first. So we do those first, and then we go ahead and multiply the radicals. 5 times 3, which is 15. And then we can also take that to the radical 6. Now, in front of the radical 6, there's technically a 1 in front of radical 6. So it'd be -7 times 1, which is -7, and then radical 5 times radical 6, which is radical 30. And then we still have that plus radical 15 at the very end. Now we have addition. So when we have addition, that means combine like terms. So we can only combine radicals if they have the same radicand, or the part that's under the radical. So we can combine the -14 radical 15 with the +1 radical 15. That gets us -13 radical 15, and then we keep the -7 radical 30. And that is our final answer. Moving on to 45, if you look at this, it looks like FOIL, and it is. So on this one, we're going to FOIL. So we're going to do our first terms. 5 times 5 is 25. And then our outer terms, 5 times negative radical 13, which is -5 radical 13. And then our inner terms, radical 13 times +5, which is +5 radical 13. And then radical 13 times negative radical 13, which is radical 169. And then we can simplify. So if we look at our middle terms, they actually cancel each other out. So those will cancel. We'll have 25 minus, and then radical 169 is 13. If we do 25 minus 13, we end up with 12 for our final answer. All right, moving on to 44. Now we're going to throw in some division here. When we divide fractions that have a radical in them, we keep in mind that the 60 divided by 6, we'll do that separately from the radical 35 divided by the radical 7. So 60 divided by 6 is 10. Radical 35 divided by radical 7 is radical 5. So just think about if you were doing 35 divided by 7 is 5, but you have a radical over it. And then radical 20 has a perfect square that goes into it, which is 4. We can do 4 times 5. And then we can go ahead and break down radical 4 to be 2. The square root of 4 is 2. Since these have the same radical, radical 5, we can actually combine those and do 10 minus 2 is 8. So we get 8 radical 5 for our final answer. Moving on to 47. This is multiplication. We love when we see multiplication with fractions because it's pretty easy. We just multiply across. So 3 times 11 on top is 33, and then 4 times 2 on the bottom is 8. We see, is there a number that goes into 33 and 8 evenly? There is not. So we leave it as 33 over 8. If there was, we would just reduce that. For number 48, that's division. So with division, we had that saying where it's take the second fraction, or don't ask why, take the second fraction, flip it, and multiply. So this would technically be 7/3, so that first fraction stays the same. We change it to multiplication, and we flip the second fraction. So we flip it over, and now we have multiplication. So on top, we would do 7 times 15, and then on the bottom we do 3 times 14. So it's kind of turned into a problem like number 47. So on the top we get 105, and on the bottom we get 42. So those are some big numbers, but we want to see, is there a common number that goes into both? And there is, and we can reduce that to 5/2. Okay, so this next one, we automatically go ahead and make that -5 a fraction by putting it over 1. Now, when we have addition, this is where we have to get common denominators. And as well, we'll have to do that on 50 because there's subtraction. Now, 51, there's multiplication, so we don't have to worry about that. All right, so 49, it looks like we have 7 on the opposite side. So we always multiply by the opposite denominator. So on this side over here, I'm multiplying by 7 over 7. On this side, I'm multiplying by 1 over 1. So my -5 over 1 is going to turn into -35 over 7 once I multiply. And then my 6 over 7, that'll stay 6 over 7 because multiplying something by 1 doesn't affect it. Then we do -35 plus 6, and we get -29 over 7, and that's our final answer. For 50, it's the same deal, we just have subtraction. So over here on the 1/8, we're going to multiply by 3 over 3 because 3 is the opposite denominator. And on this side, we multiply by 8 over 8 because that's the opposite denominator. So over here, we have 3 over 24. 3 times 8 is 24. And on the right-hand side, we have 8 over 24. And we can subtract there, and we get a -5 on top. 3 minus 8, keep our 24 for the denominator. And then moving over to number 51, this is multiplication. So with multiplication, again, we multiply across. Radical 3 times radical 2 is radical 6. And then on the bottom, 2 times 2 is 4. There's nothing that we can break down with radical 6 over 4. And you think about this way. Radical 6 and radical 6 and regular 4 are very, very different type of terms. So we cannot divide those, we cannot simplify that. If radical 6 had a perfect square, we definitely could, but there's no perfect square that goes into radical 6. All right, 52. So this one is one that we have to get a common denominator because of that addition sign. So addition means common denominator. 52 is nice because we already have that common denominator of 5. But the real trick to this problem comes with the radical 7 plus the radical 3. We talked about previously, if we go back, where was my addition? Right over here, nope, that was not radical addition. Right here, when we added this negative radical, -14 radical 15 and the positive 1, we could add those because they both were radical 15. So if we go back to our problem, since we have a radical 7 and a radical 3, we can't add those together. We can put them right next to each other and give them a common denominator of 5, but they cannot be added together to get radical 10. We just leave them as they are. Now over here for 53, kind of the same deal. We already have a common denominator of 2, so we can go ahead and put our denominator of 2. And 1 and radical 3, those are not similar, so we cannot combine them. We just leave them as 1 plus radical 3. You could also write radical 3 plus 1, and it wouldn't be wrong. Order does not matter there. All right, for number 54, we do not have common denominators. So we're going to do our trick where we multiply by the opposite denominator. And so my first fraction will be 2 square root of 2 over 6. And my second will be 3 radical 2 over 6. Now, if we look at our denominator, it's 6, common. And then our radical 2 2 radical 2 minus 3 radical 2 is a -1 radical 2. You don't have to write the -1. You can just leave it as negative radical 2 if you would like. And again, we could combine those because they both had a radical 2. And that is the end of Unit 14 review.